All right. Kevin back with you for another episode of the $1 Million Relationships Podcast. And today I'm here with Govindh Jayaraman. Govindh, awesome to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thanks, man. Kev, I am thrilled to be here. I'm like really stoked.
Me
Uh,
too. I mean, you and I have had a couple conversations recently. You've invited me to be a guest on your podcast, which was a really awesome experience, and now here we are. And I'll tell you what, man, I know I was sharing this with you before we hit the record button. I'm just on cloud nine right now because I got just some really awesome stuff happening right now.
yeah,
And and like you were saying, it's awesome being us, man.
yeah, it sure is. It sure is, and it's
And
it's fun. It's fun when, especially in the work that you do, and to some degree the work that I do, is we do it with others, right? Like, I mean, it's co-creation, and when you see things come together that has other fingers in the cake, and it all comes together beautifully, everybody wins, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful,
yeah,
beautiful, yeah.
yeah. You and I were talking before we hit the record button because we were trying to figure out how did we get connected and stuff because usually pretty much every guest we've released 245 episodes of this podcast and pretty much everyone I was connected with through somebody and you and I were really trying to figure this out and we kind of you kind of think I think it might have been I saw you comment on something that Alex Sharfin put out there and I'm just like, as soon as you mentioned Alex's name, Govind, I just kind of got these goosebumps because I'm really close with Alex and Katie. And when my buddy Brad Costanzo, 2.5 years ago, I was down in San Diego visiting with him and we were having lunch. And he's the one that was like suggesting, Kevin, you should really consider hosting a podcast. And when I asked him why he thought that, because I'm going to tell you at the time, Govin, hosting a podcast was not even on my radar at all, not one bit. And I'm like, why do you say that? And and he's been hosting a podcast at that time for like 10 years. It's called Bacon Wrapped Business. And you can tell just from the name of it that Brad is an easy going, laid back guy. And he's also a really brilliant business strategist. And he's like, Kevin, he's like, you will host the podcast and you will absolutely love it just because you will love talking with the entrepreneurs because that's who you are. And he's like, and you won't mess it all up trying to figure out how to monetize it. But yet you totally will, and it'll happen completely organically. And I'm like, okay. I was like, I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you. But I was like, Brad, the last thing the business world needs is another Me Too podcast. How do I separate this thing apart if I was to do it? He's like, Kev, he's like, you are going to talk with entrepreneurs about their most valuable relationships. And I'm like, oh man, I was like, that sounds good. And he's like, see, I told you you'd do this just because you'd love doing it.
Yeah.
and so I was like, okay, I'm in. I'm going to start doing this. So I said, I'm going to go home. And next week, when I'm in my office, I'm going to start reaching out to a few of my entrepreneur friends and just let them know, hey, I'm thinking about doing this podcast. Can we hop on Zoom? I'd like to talk with you about your most valuable relationships and just have a conversation. And Govin, Alex Sharfin was one of the first ones. I don't remember exactly which one. He was definitely top 10. He was one of the first 10 I ever did. And he shared this amazing experience. And the person that he honored was one of his high school teachers that at the time, Alex was getting into a lot of trouble in high school, going down a bad path. And this teacher not only changed his life and got his back on the right path, it has led to so many things in his life. And he and this teacher are still close friends to this day and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
know, I know that story, and it's a beautiful story, and
it is.
it's a source of a lot of inspiration in his life to this day, for sure.
Yeah.
And anybody who's listening who doesn't know Alex Sharfin, look him up, follow his stuff. He is a special human being, and he and his wife Katie are special human beings.
Yeah. And, it was doing that. Those initial conversations that I had was just confirmation that Brad was right, that this was, because here we are now, 2.5 years later, 245 episodes plus released. And this has been hands down the most rewarding and impactful thing I have done in my 28 years as an entrepreneur. You know,
Yeah.
and I am just so jazzed for every conversation and every interview I get to do. And it has exponentially impacted everything I was already doing. I mean, there 2.5 years ago, I didn't even, I mean, I couldn't even, if you told me where I'd be sitting right here, right now, I couldn't even imagine that. But yet, here we are, and I'm really excited about where we are right now. And I'm also totally stoked when I think about where we're going to be in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I can only imagine. And I'm really honored and looking forward to having this conversation with you. And when I kind of just want to start off is just by turning it over to you, so that we can set a little bit of context, let the listeners know a little bit about who Govindh is, and we'll talk about what you do, who you serve, what inspires you most about the work that you do and the impact you're making in the world.
Uh, wow, man, that's really, really that's a big question. So I've always believed that that feeling empowered to make the small changes in our lives that coalesce into this big change that we want to make in the future is really important, right? So small changes, helping people feel empowered to make those small changes in their lives that can ultimately turn into big things. And that every company that I've ever started, everything that I've ever done that has at all been successful has been around that small changes make a big difference. And in those, if we can all commit to those small changes, man, the world would be a better place. And I've been lucky enough to be involved in renewable fuel and in software development as it relates to health and wellness. And it's sort of my biggest, most well-known project is Paper Napkin Wisdom, but it wasn't the biggest company, but it's the most well-known thing. But all of those things are based on small little things that have, actionable impact that is far greater than the change that you're making. Like even the renewable fuel that I was involved with, biodiesel, even at 1% concentrations, has incredible impact to reduce emissions and impact on the globe. So 1% biodiesel had this gigantic disproportionate impact on the emissions that were coming out of those vehicles. So small change, big difference. And that's been the pattern for me. Like I believe the small changes make a big difference, and together we can change the world. That's where that comes from, and that's what drives me. I mean, that's if it's everything, that's everything for me.
Yeah, yeah. So what is an example of where you've been able to help somebody in this area and ended up helping them get a result that you were just incredibly proud of?
I help somebody do that. Well, I think there are a lot of them. I don't know that I can tell a lot of the stories because in some cases they'd be coaching clients through Paper Napkin and things like that. So, but what I will say, one of the things that I'm really proud of, like super super proud of, that I was able to do, and our team was able to do, was early on in biodiesel. I mean, when I got into biodiesel, the industry didn't exist really. It didn't happen. When you ask people about biodiesel, they'd immediately start talking about ethanol, and when we got involved, we were able to introduce almost that 1% change in the marine diesel environment that was in New York Harbor in 1 year, and that made a big difference, right? So we did a really great job there, and then together with some partners, we did this really cool thing where we had this closed loop in the city of San Francisco, and it was the only time that it's ever happened, where we were recovering a lot of the vegetable oil from all the restaurants with a partnership there, then converting it into biodiesel locally, and then returning it back into the city fleet in terms of the buses and transportation. That was really cool too. So I mean, those are really, cutting edge
Yeah.
things that we did back then. And then more recently, my tech was really supportive and responsible for helping, 40,000 kids get back to school in New York State, where when COVID happened and the shutdown happened, some of the biggest school districts in New York State weren't able to do all the COVID screening that they had to do to bring people safely back into school. We empowered them to be able to do that at scale, and so they could open up on time and stay open. And our schools actually had a great track record of staying open throughout the pandemic because they stayed healthy. So I'm really proud of that. So again, small changes, little things that had
Yeah.
really big impact, and
Yeah.
lucky to have worked with great teams on both sides of that. And
Yeah.
if you really look at it, like renewable fuel and technology that keeps kids in school, like those are really different things, but they're all centered around this small thing that can have a big impact.
That's right. That's right. That's one of the things that Joe Polish always says. I've heard him say that for years, is little hinges swing big doors, and that's exactly what you're talking about, is little, I mean, just even that idea that Brad was just suggesting, you should really consider hosting a podcast. And here's why. It wasn't even on my radar, but I'm like, what a massive impact that has had, just this
on so
one
many
little
people, right? On so
Yeah.
many people. And that's the other thing about Paper Napkin. When I started Paper Napkin, I think I did it for me, right? I mean, so Paper Napkin is this idea that people share a pearl of wisdom
Yeah.
on a plain paper napkin, and we talk about why it's important to them. And I think this is the best stuff that I've ever been involved with, because when we have these conversations, we get really deep into why, not just here's the pearl of wisdom, here's my advice, no, we get to how someone learned it, where it came from, what was behind it. And that story shows how vital and important it is to that person. And, for me, and I think this is true of a lot of entrepreneurs. We all feel sort of lonely as an entrepreneur, as a leader. We're alone. We're isolated. We can't share everything that's on our minds with our teams, and we have all these filters that we put ourselves through. And some of those are really good, right? Some of those are drive and resilience, but sometimes it doesn't work. And for me, and I'll just give you, my personality has always been to swing for the fences, like swing out of my shoes. That idea where someone's what happens? Babe Ruth, right? Greatest
Yep.
home run hitter of all time,
Yep.
perhaps, but also biggest strikeout artist of all time.
Yep.
And so I think that for me, because I have this tendency to desire to swing out of my shoes, I strike out a lot. And I think I'm not alone in that. But I strike out, and I'm willing to talk about the fact that I've struck out. And so I don't have to be Iron Man in front of everybody. I have failed. Things haven't worked out. And what that's taught me is resilience, the value of having really great people around you who empower you, to remind you of who you really are, so you can feel resilient and act in the face of challenge. Yeah. And we can do anything if we're willing to pay the price for greatness. But sometimes we're sitting there in the mud and the blood and the guts and beer or whatever, and we forget who we are. And we forget what we're capable of. And when we forget and I think the best people, and I know you've done this a lot, Kevin, and you've talked to a lot of people, and I'll bet you 100% of the time, you'll tell me it's true, that the people that they honor are the people that were there with them in hard times.
Yes.
Not in great times.
Yes.
When we lose our way, when we forget who we are, when it's dark and lonely and sad and desperate, those are the people in those moments who remind us of who we are. And I'll bet you 9 times out of 10, in fact, 99 times out of 100, 999,999 times out of a million, that those people are the people that your people bring up in your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I can so relate to what you're saying, because, and every time we get introduced to a new level, there is that, at least for me, and I know a lot of people deal with this too, this, whether you want to call it imposter syndrome, whether, I just interviewed another gal for the podcast earlier, and she was telling me, that she used to, that when she find herself in a room of really successful entrepreneurs, she used to question her own worthiness. I don't belong here. What am I even doing here? These people are doing, and I can relate to that. I mean, my gosh, the first Genius Network meeting I ever went back in 2008, there was 35 members at that time. And that first 2-day event, I mean, even that first day, I'm like, what the heck? And I told Joe afterwards, because, Joe and I had gone back for a while already, because I had a carpet cleaning and restoration business. And so Joe had helped me really build that business before I sold it. And he invited me to Genius Network. But after that first meeting, I'm like, Joe, these people are doing stuff that's so much bigger than me. I'm like, what am I doing? Joe, I don't belong here. And he's like, Kev, yes, you do. He's like, yes, you do. I would have never invited you here if I didn't think you belonged here. He's like, you are gonna ride this out, and you are gonna find out that you have so much value to offer. And he was right. And I'm really grateful to people like Joe who saw things in me that I couldn't see for myself. Because we all deal with this. And shit, I talk with millionaires and billionaires who deal with this. Yeah, no. Oh,
yeah, but isn't it great when we meet people who treat us like they see us, like we could be, not as we are. They see in us and they treat us in the way that we could be as opposed to the way we are. And that helps us raise our own standards, realize and reveal our own greatness, and reveal who we are to ourselves. And I think that when we are, I think the struggle in life is that we have to make it bad and make it better, and we get better and better and better, and we just have to keep on trying. And that imposter syndrome doesn't go away. And you're right about that. Like, I was talking to a guy the other day, and he was telling me, and he's a big guy, like he's internationally famous guy. And he was saying, every now and then, to this day, I still have this moments when I get into my car, or I arrive at home at the end of my day, and I wonder if I just blew it all, and if it's all going to go away. Like, did I screw up so badly today that I just lost it? And he still wonders that. And I was like, he goes, yeah, it happens less often, and it happens for a shorter amount of time, but it still happens. And I think that ability in us. So for me, one of the things that I get really charged out of is equipping people with the system, tools, and structures, like the ideas that support their own mental capacity to realize how great they are, right? So they can remind themselves how. And I think Napkin does that because it's a simple idea. It's a simple thing. And there's an Encyclopedia Britannica, like there's this for people listening who aren't of our vintage, Kevin. Encyclopedia Britannica is what people use before Google, and
that's right.
GPT answered all your questions for you. But it's this. It's this. If you had to bring every single business problem and personal leadership issue and bring it all in one place and have a conversation about it, that's on paper napkin. And people talk about not only the problem, but the solution every single time, because that's the solution is what they give up front. That's their napkin, their wisdom, the thing they want to give as advice. But then they get into the problem, and that's where the value is. That's where the juice is. And I think, I'm a voracious learner. I love to learn. And I've learned this about myself, that I am my best version of myself when I am learning a ton. When I'm sitting there at the trough of information and education and just absorbing it, I become really good. But it's not just absorbing it, but it's sharing it. So absorbing it's one part, sharing it's the other part. So that's where napkin comes in, paper napkin comes in, where I get to absorb this great learning from these great minds, these great people, these absolutely, like I had James Clear on Paper Napkin Wisdom in 2014 before Atomic Habits was Atomic Habits. So he came on, talks about systems, tools, and measurement, right? And he talks about systems being greater than goals in on a napkin. That was his napkin. And
Yeah.
then he went off and became an international mega bestseller, huge book, right? I mean, everybody's heard of Atomic Habits. Back
Yep.
then, he called himself a photographer and weightlifter. That was
Interesting.
what his bio was, right?
Wow.
So
Wow.
so we've
Wow.
had some really, really interesting minds share some really powerful wisdom
Yeah.
over the years, but it's timeless. So being at the trough, learning about where that wisdom comes from, and then being able to share it, that's the stuff that really gets me jacked and gets me going. So
Yeah.
the work that really empowers me, the work that makes me feel really good, is when I'm doing that with organizations, when I'm doing that with individuals,
Mhm.
through the work that we do in Paper Napkin. That's where I want to spend the rest of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, okay. So now that we've got some context set here, I'm going to switch gears just a little. I'm going to reiterate the question for the benefit of our listeners. So, Govind, have you ever been introduced to a person or persons who completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person or persons? And I'm just really excited to hear your story and your experience around this topic of relationships.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna I think there's so many people. I'm really lucky. I'm blessed. But Paper Napkin wouldn't happen. Like the thing that I want to do, I mean, I wrote a book called Paper Napkin Wisdom with Jack Daly. None of those things would have happened. Paper Napkin Wisdom wouldn't have happened. My businesses probably wouldn't have grown to the way they did. Um, the house that we even moved into wouldn't have happened. Probably would have messed up my relationship with my wife, if I hadn't gotten into an organization called EO. So Entrepreneurs Organization. I joined, um, I want to say like in '08 or '09,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
long, long time ago. So, we're talking 16 years ago. And, um, and I met a few people that became, so how EO is organized, there are forums, a group of, 4 to 10 people, all entrepreneurs, all running businesses of a certain size. They're put together in a forum and they work together. I met this guy. He was at my interview for joining EO,
Okay.
and thought, wow, like at the time I had this fuel company that did very little business locally, but lots of business in the U.S. I mean, throughout my life, 99% of my business has been in the U.S. and very little of it in Canada. Um, and and so this guy ran a local company, a smaller company at the time, and he and I became friends over the years. But that's not what was great about it. What was great about it was he became the chapter president at one point.
Okay.
And when he became the chapter president at one point, he asked me, or told me, or Volin told me, to take on a role on the board at the time. And it was a role of learning. And the learning role is a person who's responsible for building a calendar of events where you bring speakers in and you bring events together. But we were a little chapter. We didn't really have money to do anything. So we had to get really creative about how we did these things. And that that set me off on a journey, because I talked about this, right? I'm at my best when I'm learning. So I stopped. I was always a big reader, fast study. I could learn a lot about an industry very quickly. I could get to that 80% level really fast. I really understand things really fast, and you know, being able to absorb a lot of information is really good, especially if you're an entrepreneur. But what was really great about what George did for me, and that was his name, George Bazormany, what he did for me was he gave me this thing that I was really uncomfortable. I didn't want it. I didn't get it. I didn't have the capacity for it. I was too busy. I didn't really want to be involved. I was happy just hanging out in my forum and doing whatever. I thought I was getting plenty of value. And and he set me off on this journey where I got to in '07, in '08, '07, '08, and onward, meet some really influential people, like people who become big names, like Cameron Harold, and become friends with these people. Like at the time, I couldn't even imagine that. The idea that I could just have a conversation with them was great, or have a dinner with them was great. So I started to get pretty excited about, oh, I could book these speakers and then I could drive them. Um, I'll pick them up at the airport and then I'll drop them off at their hotel. Oh, and then maybe I could talk them into having dinner with me. And then, oh, maybe I could spend some extra time with them. And maybe I could call them up and every now and then. And, maybe. And my approach started to become, there's so much I can learn from them. And I was just starting to pull at these ropes of information. And you know what I realized along that way is the best people who have all this information, all this wisdom to share, just want to give it away to people who want to listen. And I was like, pick me. I'm in. I'll be that guy. I'll listen to everything you have to tell me. I'm in. And so, the guy who really changed a lot of things for me was George, because at the time I didn't want to take this role on. And I told everybody I was out. I didn't want it. But he just made me do it and forced me to do it. And I, really, I'm grateful, because at the time I was 400 pounds. My business was growing out of control. I was growing out of control. I was doing the thing. I was doing the entrepreneur trap, which is I'm going to immerse myself in my work and I'm going to sacrifice everything else. And then my work is going to be so lucrative that I can have the time. I'll buy back my time then to take care of myself and my family, and hope and stupidly thinking that my health would still be there and my family would still be there, like not thinking that I could jeopardize any of those things with the way that I was behaving. And not that either of them were real jeopardy, maybe, but they could have been if I continued on that trajectory. And then, because of that door opening, I went to one of the leadership conferences in Louisiana, met a whole bunch of really great entrepreneurs, and I'd already met Cameron Harold at an event. Then I went there and I met Warren Rustand at an event. It was like, oh my God, who's this guy? And then I met, and everybody, everywhere I met, it was like other amazing, incredible people who all they wanted to do was share their wisdom with you. All they wanted to do is help you out. All they wanted to do was share. And it was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. And over that period of time, and now it's obviously many years later, but part of the virtue of that is obviously paper napkin became a product of that. But I'm 230 pounds now. I'm 170 pounds. Like I'm a human and a half less than I was back then. I'm healthy. I've got a great relationship with my family. We've had significant ups and downs, not just as a family, but as like health wise and otherwise, as the world has over the last several years. And notwithstanding any of those things, I've been able to have the ability to be there for them. And I think it's one of the things that when you and I started to speak more personally, Kevin, and I hope I'm not speaking out of school, because I don't think I am because of the pictures behind you, but family is super important to you. And to me, it's central. And when I think back to the path that I was on, that was taking it for granted, it just like it kills me. Like, I can't believe I did that. And the second person that's really big, that I got introduced through that was Alex.
Okay.
And Alex is a really special person in my life. Alex Sharfin and I met through EO, and we were friends that way. And our families have gotten together a couple times at various conferences. And so I met Katie, and Alex has met Stacy, and I met the girls. He's had me speak. So the first place that the Paper Napkin Wisdom book was ever available was at Breakthrough in Austin, with Alex and Katie. And so Alex has been very important to me all the way through. But in 2020, when the pandemic hit, something because we weren't doing this, we would talk all the time, but like regularly. But then we started talking all the time. Like we built a scheduled call every Tuesday, and Alex and I, for 4 years, have maintained an every Tuesday conversation. That of course, life happens, and it's not always every Tuesday. But Alex is there, and I'm there with him, and we have seen each other through this absolutely tumultuous period, walking side by side. And if every I would pray that everybody has a friend as good as George or Alex, because without these two people in my life, I don't know where I'd be.
Yeah.
And George has never left, and even more recently, when things got dark through the pandemic, and I can get into that a little bit later. When things got really dark for me, both of them were there. Both of them were there, and we were there every. Alex was there every week, and man, I'm so grateful to both of these men.
Yeah. So for you, how did these two men just help support you? Because you know what, man, I mean, some entrepreneurs were able to pivot. Pivot became a big word after the pandemic. A lot of entrepreneurs were pivoting, but I mean, at the time, I know I was doing a whole lot of in-person events. And in fact, I had an event scheduled for March of 2020 that did not happen, and I did pivot, and that's when I started really making use of Zoom. And that turned out to be a good thing. I mean, I have, well, for example, one of my clients, Eric, he's in the merchant processing space, and pretty much all, not all, but most of his clients are in the travel and hospitality industry. So his business plummeted when COVID hit, and was like probably 10% of what it had been once COVID hit and stuff. And so he and a lot of businesses were impacted that way. So how did you end up getting impacted because of COVID, and how did these two gentlemen support you through that?
Well, so my problem actually started before that.
Okay.
So in 2018, thereabouts, my youngest son got pretty sick. He contracted bacterial meningitis, which is a potentially fatal illness. Very few, if you have it as bad as he had it, usually goes pretty bad. And unfortunately, I have a couple doctors in my family. My brother and his wife are both physicians, so which is fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate because we've got some great advice, but at the same time, you get the straight goods also.
Yep.
So I was aware of how bad this could go pretty early. He was so sick, he was in the ICU for some time, and I made a decision. I had to make a decision, and I wanted to make a decision spontaneously that anything that required me to travel was over, done. And so at the time, Paper Napkin Wisdom was growing. I was doing a lot of CEO coaching. I was doing a lot of strategy consulting or coaching. So I do annual planning, quarterly planning for organizations, and something I love to do and I'm pretty good at. I was doing that strategy summit facilitation globally. I'd done hundreds of them already, and was doing more, scheduled to do more. I was regarded globally as one of the better ones, people doing it. There was a program called Accelerator that I used to love to facilitate as well globally, and I was again, I loved it, and I think that in my foolishness at that time, I thought I could just, I thought I could just let that stuff go, and I run my business, and everything would be fine. I'll just be here, but I didn't realize at the time just how much what was happening at home was impacting me. Like I just wasn't myself, and so I started to lose my way. And just, I think for entrepreneurs who are used to peak performance, when you're off 1% is a big deal. Like 1%, when you're at a high level, 1% is a big deal.
Yeah.
And I just didn't realize that I was off. I didn't realize how much this was impacting me. I knew it was a big deal, but I thought I had it. I got it. I got it. I got it. Right? I'm good. I'm good. Just put my head down and bowl through. And so a couple of years goes by. My youngest is okay, which is great. He's fine. He's back to himself. Pandemic hits. So I was already struggling and didn't realize it. And then the pandemic happened and hit me hard. And then everybody's hurting, right? And but we pivot, which is another way of saying you strike out over here, so you try again another at bat over here. So I swung out of my shoes over here. We did this really great work with school districts in the U.S. and started to build a company and a product around it, which was, well, we had the product, but we built a company around it. And I think we got all pretty excited about it, right? Like we all got pretty excited about it. But then the pandemic shifted again, and the need for that product didn't translate into a live world in the same way. And I think the 4 years or so of band-aids and cover up and I got it just sort of caught up to me. So I think it sort of hit hard in 2022 for me.
Okay.
And it was somewhere around there, somewhere between 2020 and 2022. It hit really, it sort of increasingly hit hard. And what was really great is I already had this rhythm with Alex, and he was there all the way through it, through the ups and the downs. And I don't know, I think we both just found each other when we needed it, and he was there. And then more recently, George, who never went anywhere, but just like Alex, he was always there. But George sort of stepped up and has even been a greater reminder of who I am. And so I think people talk about how your great friends will hold a mirror up and say, yeah, here's a mirror. This is what you are. Your best friends hold a picture up. And the picture is how they see you. Not how you see yourself, but how they see you. And they remind you of how they see you. Your best friends will show up and fight for you to remember who you are.
Yeah.
And everybody deserves a friend like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That is such a powerful story. And I think, do you know who Jesse Elder is by chance? Does that no? Okay. I know Alex and Jesse know each other. And Jesse has been a powerful force in my life. And I first met him back in 2012. Man, time flies. We've known each other for about 12 years. But I remember January, in the spring of 2013, I had hired him, and he was working with me, and he was doing consulting with me, helping me grow the business, the publishing business I owned at the time. But we were at this event, one of Yannick Silver's underground events back in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
And at the end of that event, the last day, Jesse and I were having lunch, and he kind of, he was like telling me how he's like, Kevin, he's like, he's like, it's really interesting. He's like, I've been watching you over the last couple days. And he's like, he's like, I've seen you in conversations with a lot of people, whether it was at the bar, in the hallway, having a meal, whatever. And he's like, it's really interesting when you watch a lot of people in conversations, because a lot of times when there's two people having a conversation, there's one person that's actively engaged, but the other person is not. They're scanning the room, or they're just looking for how I can get out of this conversation. But he's like, every single time I saw you in a conversation with anybody, both you and them were 100% engaged. It was like the Get Smart dome came down over the top of you, and that you guys were just in this dome, just completely engaged. And he's like, I just wanted to point that out to you, because he's like, you have a way of interacting with people. You have a way of making people feel seen, heard, and understood in a way that few people do. And I kind of was like, I was really grateful to him for sharing that. And he's like, what do you think about this? And I was like, Jesse, I have really appreciated having you in my life, and I have really appreciated the work that we've been doing together. And I really like this new me. And Jesse, he kind of chuckles. He's like, Kev, he's like, this ain't the new you, man. He's like, this is the real you. And that was such an epiphany. And what you talk about, having somebody in our lives that can not just hold up a mirror, but hold up a picture and say, this is who you really are. And Jesse has definitely been one of those people for me that will call things out. And I kept, do you realize that? And I remember in January of last year, so we're talking, almost 2 years ago now, I was having a conversation, and I was feeling inferior, or feeling like, man, Kev, do you really got the goods? Are you really all that good at what you do? And just feeling like a little bit of imposter syndrome. And Jesse was like, Kev, he said, I know you get people telling you, thanking you and doing that. And he's like, do you keep a file of your wins and when people share wins? And I was like, no. I was like, I don't. He said, you need to start keeping a file. Every time somebody sends you a message, you screenshot it, and you just start keeping a file, whether it's in your cell phone, on a computer, whatever. But start keeping a file of your wins. And whenever you feel like you're wondering, do you really got the goods? Can you really deliver? Are you really all of that? You just look at that file. Yeah. And he's like, the more that file grows, and that file's gotten pretty big in the last almost 2 years, and he was right, because all I got to do is look at it. And now I find myself hardly ever having to look at it, because it continues to grow and grow and grow. And I'm just like, it's there, and it keeps on getting bigger, and like, yep, you're the man. Right. And it's really helpful.
Yeah. So I think we all need a reminder of
for sure,
who we really are.
Yeah.
And and that's a really great share, right? Because everybody needs it. Everybody needs to remember who they really are. Yeah. And everybody needs that. People used to tell me that I was too optimistic, right? People would tell me, look, I get it. My optimism is a great strength. It's also a weakness. It's a weakness for me, because I can see a way out of everything. You can do it. You could do it. I always see it. And that's a great gift. And also something that you've got to manage. However, we all need that. we all need to remember what's possible, and we're possible. And especially in these times where hard, it's challenging, it's like there's no failure to be had right now, right? If you're willing to take another step, and if you remember who you really are, you have the resilience to do it no matter the circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think that if anybody can learn anything from my story, is it doesn't matter how many times you strike out, you step up to the plate.
Yeah.
Just step up to the plate and remember who you really are, because eventually, you know, eventually you're going to reveal it to yourself, and you're going to reveal it to everybody else. And you have, but you can't lose sight of it. You can't lose faith. You can't. Um, you have to learn. You have to grow, but you can't lose faith in who you are.
That's
And
right.
that's so important. And I remember reading a book a long time ago, where in the book, and it's an interesting book. People, it's an old book. It's called Conversations with God, and the author is Neil Donald Walsh. And he wrote this book, and he said, "What was the meaning of life?" And in this book, he says, "Becoming who you really are." And I think that's really the gift, right? The gift of life is to become who you really are,
Yeah.
thought, word, and action. And if you're able to live that way, and if you're able to surround yourself with people who love you enough to remind you of who you really are when you're feeling down, that's the gift.
Yeah.
That's the gift that everybody should have.
That's
And,
right. That's right.
I think you're talking about that, and I think that I'm talking about that, and I think that anybody who comes on your podcast, I bet you, in some way, shape, or form, is really talking about that, right? I mean, maybe it's a deal, and maybe it's a thing, but I'll bet you most of the time, it's somebody who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself.
Yeah.
And that's the gift.
Yeah.
That's the person. That's a real friend. And
That's right.
everybody deserves a friend like that. And look,
You
and
bet.
one of the beautiful things that you have, like I'll say this honestly, one of the beautiful things that people have in the world today that they probably didn't have before is they have your podcast. So they can go out there and know that people like that are out there. They can know that for everyone, there are other people out there that have their back and can hold up a picture of how they see you and remind you of that. Paper napkins like that, paper napkin wisdoms like that. There are places where you can go and fill your bucket when your bucket is low.
Yeah. Amen. Well, Govin, I just really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. And for anybody who's listening into this going, man, Kev, that was good. I really love Govin. I love how he shows up. Any resources, any websites that we can share with them and include?
Yeah, so Paper Napkin Wisdom is a podcast. It's available everywhere, but where you can get me is at papernapkinwisdom.com.
Okay.
And on LinkedIn and Facebook, and everywhere that digital stuff lives, you can find me. I'm not hard to find. But papernapkinwisdom.com is our website, and Paper Napkin Wisdom, the podcast, is available everywhere. And yeah, reach out. I'd love it if people reached out. And look, if you're listening to the podcast and you don't have that person, reach out. I'll be that person for you.
That is awesome. Man, what a generous offer. Well, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I am really excited to get this out there and share it with a lot of other entrepreneurs, because I know how well it's going to be received. So thank you again, Govin. Really appreciate you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me, buddy.
You bet.